Thanks, Justus, and glad to be here. Of course, if you ask me something to do something, I will come. But you know, first love never dies, so the UvA still has a place in my heart. I wanted to share some excerpts from a book I'm writing with Jeroen Ome, and I return actually to that topic of the book of '95, The Politics of Environmental Discourse. And at a time that I think we need social theory more than ever. And in particular, I'm sort of exploring if we should not bring back to the fore an old tradition that we have in the social sciences of utopian social science. I mean, there's a lot to be said. You could devote a lecture to that, why that was discredited by Popper and so forth. But still, the idea that we are, in a way, responsible also to think of better worlds, which is sort of the essence of utopian thought, I think is something we may want to consider as something we want to entertain in the next years. So, after having done the discourse analysis, I realized more and more that not only what language people use, but also where they say it matters. So the sort of the analytical scheme that the book uses is the one that was sort of spelled out in 2009, where you basically say, okay, there is also dramaturgy. As you can analyze politics as theater. You should actually, I think, analyze politics as theater. You should immediately think any room you walk into, the Goffman sort of inclination. What sort of situation is this, right? I mean, if the chairs are like this or like that, what is the script actually that is hidden in putting the chairs like this, etc. And so that whole idea of looking at not only the discursive but also the dramaturgical, I think adds a whole new dimension. And you would then also say how things are said, like in a discourse analysis, but also where they are said and to whom. And well, here is such a situation. And this is probably the picture that is you see most in environmental politics. If people sort of want to narrate the history, it's 2015, right? It is Paris, the Paris Agreement. And for sure, this was a significant moment. It was a serious treaty that was signed, but it was also sort of indicative of the way in which we thought of environmental politics. And that is really the tradition of the United Nations system. And so the dramaturgy of the United Nations system was imposed on environmental politics. Or actually, there was a politics of imposing that logic of thinking about solutions on the environmental issue. But of course, to do that, we needed to change what environmental politics was about, what the environmental problem was. Otherwise, it wouldn't fit the categories of the United Nations Forum. So if you want to understand environmental politics and Paris, of course, you need to understand international relations and international diplomacy. And that is something that many of our colleagues nowadays see, right? They say, well, there's actually such a thing as summit theater. I mean, look at the way in which constantly we reinforce that summit theater. So media love predictability. The one big mistake about media is that they love news. They don't love news. They want predictability. Repeated formats to constantly ask the same question. So a COP, a Conference of the Parties, is a delightful theatrical entertainment because it is again the same format. You know what questions to raise. And the assumption, of course, of Paris is that there is a cockpit, that leaders lead. And leaders love it actually when people of the media reinforce the idea that they are in the lead, right? So you then get cockpitism. So the idea that this planet has actually a cockpit. You can steer planetary politics. This is a rehearsed choreography of doing politics. And we as critical social scientists should be resistant to that. We should not go along. We should analyze it because it is co-opted. The COP is co-opted, right? So we're now going to go to the Gulf states, and the chair of the COP is actually leading a firm that is actually going to invest more in fossil fuel exploration, extractivism. Okay, so here you have your problem, right? Now, so for us in the book, the idea is, okay, can we zoom out? Can we zoom out and get a critical edge again on the way in which we've learned to do the analysis of environmental politics, sort of critiquing that dramaturgy and finding new ways into it. Now, here in this audience, I suppose I don't need to spell out these three sort of core ideas of political science: the polity, the policy, and the politics. But that is, of course, what happened since 1972, right? We created a polity, an environmental polity of environmental diplomacy, and that is where politics was to be taking place. But in the book, we sort of speak about it, and I like always to take these long sort of analytical trips back in memory lane with 1950s political science concepts. So capture is, of course, a crucial insight of the old 1950s political science, where you say, in a particular dramaturgy, you can actually have political capture because some things cannot be meaningfully said in the context of that conference system. And actually, the definitional power, I can't dwell on it too long, is completely in the hands of a very small subset of people who are able to articulate environmental problems in a particular way. Well, to give you an example, nitrogen in the Netherlands, the nitrogen problem. So who's in charge of the definition, right? That must be a scientist, right? So the nitrogen map is a map made by scientists about a problem. Well, I think the farmers were bloody right to be critical of that sort of definition, because it just didn't pay attention at all to their definition of the problem, that they had difficulty of actually making ends meet, and were constantly said that the only future they had was to grow. So, and we call this sort of, we say there is a sort of a process of funneling or corridor formation in which the space of politics gets restrained. And what I like to do is first analyze that very briefly, and then, of course, say, okay, can we regain political space for a meaningful debate that's much broader and brings in other categories? And you could in terms of political theory, you could look at authors like Chantal Mouffe or Jacques Rancière for that, who in a new political theory way say something very similar, I think, actually to 1950s political scientists, being attentive to how institutional rules include and exclude, and also to be very attentive to the fact that these rules are policed. And the funny thing is, of course, who are doing the policing? And so that's where I anticipate quite a bit of controversy, actually, with colleagues who have devoted part of their lives to the IPCC. And so probably not in this room, but in where I'm nowadays, in the geosciences, many people, they make careers by being active in the IPCC. And I say it's inherently incapable of making the environment political in the broader sense that we now need. Now, why is that? Because it is all constrained by that logic of ecological modernization that that we spelled out, or I spelled out in that book long time ago. And so let's briefly attend what that sort of ecological modernization is. So the idea basically that you can recognize the environmental problem, solve it without social change, I would say. So it is the idea that, okay, so the combustion engine car is a problem, well, then we take an electric vehicle, right? Okay, so the gas way of firing and heating our homes is a problem. Okay, then we do electric, right? Okay, so solar PV on the roofs, the issue's resolved, nothing's changing, right? But obviously that doesn't pay attention to the fact that there is a whole logic of extractivism that relates our privileged sort of solution to problems way further in other parts of the world. But I think that in this particular context, where I must go for an easy bit and say that one of the things that I find is most stunning is how the natural sciences have actually been able to dominate the definition of the problem. So to keep thinking that you talk about something like climate change in terms of CO2. you can say, well, that is the problem, right? There is too much CO2 molecules in the atmosphere. Sure. But is that a problem, right? Or is the problem how we have a particular way of living that produces so much CO2, right? So much more of the sort of questions that the social scientists would raise. But it's really minute, the attention that is paid to that type of definition in the latest IPCC assessment. So we're now at the 6th assessment report, and dear colleagues like Linda Steg from Groningen have for the first time contributed the extent to which behavior and behavioral change can contribute to solving the problem. But if you look at the summary for policymakers, which is the text that really matters, that whole chapter is just one sentence. So the whole chapter is again about natural science definitions of the problem. What many people in climate politics know is that the Americans in the 1990s said, well, there's one thing you should all understand. We will only resolve the issue and help resolve it if it's based on market-based instruments. So if you're going to think about things like taxes and so forth, or to constrain the American way of life, we're not going to sign the Kyoto Protocol. Now, what then happened was that those people that were making the climate models decided, okay, that doesn't make sense to model other opportunities because they are not going to support the diplomacy. So the models that were made in the early 1990s fit with the American bias for the American way of life. And what I actually did in the book is to put in little text boxes sort of little exchanges I had when I was part of the cockpit. So like when I was writing a report on food systems and resource requirements in 2016 for UNEP, so the Environment Programme. And I was taken apart by a delegate from a particular nation. And that delegate from that particular nation said, if you're going to do something which is going to negatively affect the farmers of my Midwest, I'm going to make sure the report doesn't come out. So, I mean, you can, in a very abstract way, talk about boundary work, but this is how boundary work actually takes place. Or if you would use the word triple planetary crisis, we cannot welcome the report. You say, what's that? Well, that's UN language for basically ruining the effect of a report. And so in these corridors of power, there's lots of arm twisting going on. And of course, academics, and in particular those who are not political scientists, that enjoy it because, hey, this is material, right? So the most natural scientists shy away from that and then do what Friedrich once called, the anticipate reaction. So you anticipate the exercise of power, okay? So that's sort of how people are funneled. You're going into the funnel. And here is, today's hero. I mean, he is the last man standing, right? Whether it's Gaza or it's the climate crisis, he is defending, human rights and our futures. But if he says, this is the decade of action, I'm afraid, Antonio, this is the impasse. This is what we sort of post-structuralists call an impasse, a moment at which the logic of the past of Paris is unhinged. And it is now a political moment because in this decade, new discursive categories can be born that give meaning to what we see around us in a different logic. And that is what I want to contribute to and where I started to devote my time to after 2015. So the point of this whole idea is that there are actually images of the future that construct politics. And I, of course, want to unpack these images of the future because they are the political moment. And we do that using a concept of techniques of futuring. So making a model is a technique of futuring. You predict something to happen, or you create a space. This is from future studies. It's called the futures cone. So there are different ways in which you can relate to the future. And what you often see is that you have a sort of a probable future, this is most likely to happen, and then politics is about preferable futures. Now, my argument is, as a discourse analyst, that these are all dominated by that eco-modernist discourse. That's all within that confines, we just create a space for discussion. But we need to break from that imaginative capture. And we have to seriously entertain the preposterous. So the preposterous is het belachelijke, the idiot proposition. Because the idiot proposition is defined from within the discourse. If a discourse is dominant and somebody says something which is outside the discourse, think of all sort of diversity rights in a singular ethnic state, right? So that then you're seen as preposterous. Helene Scholz did her PhD on Zwarte Piet. It was preposterous to question that children's party. 5 years later, we know what happened, right? So you have to have an eye for the preposterous. And my argument is that we are going to experience a reversal of the preposterous. So this is the eco-modernist way of looking to the future. This is, by the way, if you see it, that's Joe Biden as the president. And this is the Inflation Reduction Act materialized. So this is a Hummer, an EV Hummer. So this is the American way of addressing the environmental problem. But what is preposterous, right? Is it preposterous to question that lifestyle, or is it preposterous to think that this is the future? And this is, of course, the sort of reemergence of politics at the moment, right? This is already 2019. This is Yellow Vest in Paris. People protesting against an increase on the tax of petrol that they needed, because they lived in places that were far away. I mean, to critique them as not understanding climate politics is not understanding discursive politics. So we have to recoup, and I have to really speed up now. Because we have the prediction mode of looking to the future, and we have a mode of effect. And effect, and that relates nicely to your keynote actually, is something that is always ruled out. I mean, in the funnel of ecological modernization, it has to be about natural science facts and never about feelings. And what I wanted to do, and I'm going to very quickly go through the history and leave that. We can't do that in 1 minute. So just show a few slides from an intervention that I did to use all these different categories to see if people would then relate to the future differently. It was an exhibition. So as an academic, I was a curator of an exhibition in Leeuwarden in 2018, and we tried to bring the utopian back into environmental politics. And Levitas has written this wonderful book, Utopia as Method. So the idea is not that utopia is out there. It's actually a methodology of exploring possible futures. And you can then actually do things like what we did, walk into the future, and so also allow people to grieve about what they can't take into the future, like the wonderful lawn blower on petrol, a really artifact of the fossil age. And look at these categories in the exhibition space, where you also could actually feel nature rather than have it in terms of statistics. And what we measured in focus groups and other methods is that actually people through that exhibition started to think about the future differently. So they became more hopeful about the future, which was a challenge. I was afraid that it wouldn't work, that we say, well, it's just a gimmick. No, they said actually they were more hopeful. They saw the future as a space of possibility, and also saw something else in nature, not a CO2 overload problem, but actually some emotive power of nature that needed to be recouped. And I think that one of our colleagues, Teune Spiersma, who's a biologist from Groningen, feels that very well. So he is one of the best statistical academics in his field, but he actually now creates what I call utopian operas, where he actually tries and make people appreciate what you lose in the landscape if particular migratory birds actually suffer under the agricultural practices in that era. And this is a very different sense of politics that I had hoped to spell out in much greater detail, but alas, the time has gone. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Maarten, for this wonderful, wonderful lecture, super inspiring. I'm sure all of you are thinking, oh, you should just let him present the slides that were skipped. I want to see them as well. But I'm going to take us into some conversation space. I want to start by saying how lucky I feel to be here and listen to all our speakers today. And I feel that although we are treating all of those topics separately, they are deeply interconnected. Right? So I'd like to take some cues from the other speakers to bring us into the space of future thinking, which I personally find very inspiring. So Elke talked to us about people coming from different backgrounds to solve a problem, right? And I wanted to start by with a question of how can we engage people, or what is the space that we have for having people of very different backgrounds, with very different needs, very different values, and very different priorities in thinking about those alternative, more sustainable futures. And also, this is a two-part question, so that's the first part. And the second part is, what is the role of power in that space?
You always start with the small questions. Yeah. So no, I mean, so my argument here is, of course, first get behind the hegemonic discourse and restore the diversity of perspectives, and therefore also take away that idea that there is a cockpit, so a singular place for decision making by people who are privileged decision makers, and restore again sort of the space of uncertainty. And I think the ontological uncertainty, so that we again say, okay, so what is actually the issue that we want to resolve? And so, is it a coincidence that Amitav Ghosh, with a sort of a double cultural identity, being an Indian-born American novelist, that he is the one that sort of really peels off the environmental issue? I mean, the Nutmeg Curse as a book, I mean, it starts with the concern about climate change, and he peels it all the way off, and it is not only about the fossil age, it's not only about capitalism, it's not only about imperialism, you know, and he goes all the way back outwards, and then I think you regain the sense of the complexity of the layeredness of these discourses that are all constituting power, and say who has an authority and who has not got an authority. And you recoup automatically the domain of the preposterous, but in the sense that it doesn't make sense in the prevailing logic to speak about the nutmeg or the lamp. I don't know if you read the book, but the lamp falls, and he says that the lamp is actually an actant in this whole logic of colonial rule of the Dutch over Indonesia. And so, I mean, and how could you not address these issues if you really want to get out of that extractivist logic? And so, I mean, now lithium is crucial for EV. But where do we get it? Well, not in North Holland. So, and the European Union has now a resource strategy, and it's safeguarding our resources because we're too late. China was there first, right? Hey, that reminds me of something, right? It's Spain versus Portugal.
And in this imagining, right, of these alternative futures, how do you imagine this imagination happening, right? Yeah. Is it a process of consensus making? Is it a process of negotiation, perhaps? And how do we talk about trade-offs in this space? Because we cannot have everything or every future. It's possible, right?
Yeah, so I like to do it analytically with the techniques of futuring, so that what is not seen as to be political and show it for its political effects. So, for instance, the models, we go really deep into analyzing how modeling as an exercise plays a crucial role. So there's a science technology sort of studies type of argument, and I think that's the contribution, and to expose where all these political moments are without them being recognized as being political. So that's only an answer on the first bit of your question. What was the second bit of your question?
It's the role of negotiation and actually talking about trade-offs.
Yeah. So the question, of course, is if, I mean, people would say, okay, so the analysis is right, but what is then your alternative? And there is your issue of the trade-offs. So I've started to become convinced that the only way in which we can get out of that ecological conundrum is to really have an entirely different value preference. That is just, I can't square it. I can't see how you would reduce the burden on ecological resources without it. So, and so my latest sort of writing was on the fact that why is it that we always say that value change is so difficult? Why is that? Is there actually empirical evidence for that, right? Or is that just comfortable that value change is difficult? And so, if people would have examples, I'm really pleased to if you would share of rapid value change. And there are lots of examples of rapid value change, and that if there's another appreciation of what is an aspirational future for yourself or for the world or whatever, that has a very different footprint, then we can get out of that conundrum. And the trade-off is, of course, that we can no longer have a package holiday in Turkey. That I can't see being part of the equation. So I can see that you can solve climate change perhaps, but not biodiversity as well, and the water crisis as well, and the chemical pollution crisis as well, let alone that it can be in a just fashion. So it's the accumulation of things that you need to achieve for a proper solution that drives out all the comfortable ideas of eco-modernist EV, PV futures.
Yeah, and connected to that, right, it's the way we are thinking about this future that's not an eco-modernist future is to look at how we got here, right? In this engagement with the past and understanding all the problematic kind of decisions that were taken and that shaped this dominant way of thinking and leading us to a future that we don't want. In engaging with that, I know that we have many students in the room, and I feel, as a teacher myself, teaching on environmental issues, human environment issues, that in looking at that past and looking at all of those problematic decisions and all the outcomes, the unjust outcomes of them, it gets really depressing, right? And it paralyzes people. And sometimes it paralyzes students looking at that past. And I wonder from your experience, how then can we move from that to actually a space of engagement and let's do this together, let's change is possible, and how can we reach a balance of doing those things at the same time?
Yeah, no, so a good futurist is always a good historian, because the only way in which you can recoup a perspective is go back. And so the eco-modernism started in the late 1970s. So 1972 was the United Nations program with the conference. And then, of course, there was still quite a bit of fighting on the streets, social movements and so forth. And then they were funneled into policy making and so forth. But if you read the text of the early 1970s, there is an incredible parallel with now. And so how can it be that sort of the donut from Kate Raworth, I mean, that's almost literally 1970. I mean, degrowth, has its roots in the early 1970s. Conviviality, I mean, that's Illich. All these things have been driven out of political discourse, and they are suddenly back. So looking at the past is really hopeful. There is a narrative that's much more encompassing. It's critical about consumerist culture. It's critical about the emptiness. So the pop songs of the late 1960s, listen to the critique of their parents. I mean, that sort of critique was already already there. It's all driven out because of the illusion that now the cockpit would take care of this issue. It has not done so. It has made the problem smaller and has left out all the critical issues about that it also required social change. So Earth Day 1970, 22 million Americans on the streets. 22 million. It's the single biggest public event in the US still to this day. But that was not only about the environment, it was about dissatisfaction with the way in which things were going. Also the Vietnam War and all these things were related. So the fact that, I mean, that's what happened here with the climate march. So that some people say, hey, we don't want politics, it's just about the climate, right? That was on the Museum Square. I mean, okay, well, that was a pretty political statement. So the whole thing of sorting out what connects in what sort of way, well, that is the hopeful present. That is a hopeful present, that we no longer talk about the environment in a technocratic language, that we call climate justice now. That's different. 10 years ago, we spoke about stop climate change. Now, nobody does that anymore. It's all about climate justice now. So there is progress. The discourse is shifting, and academics, critical academics, should help that. We have privileged time. We can sit behind our computer screens. We have ChatGPT to help us, and Elke as well. I mean, let's solve it.
Wonderful, thank you. One last question, very quickly, just to take us full circle. We started with a call for changing from the university, through the university, right? Through an ethics of care. And I wanted to ask you, how do you see the role of the university also in this future-making process?
Yeah, no, so for me, there is no teaching anymore without doing that immediately. So we have yesterday started our new mixed classroom, which is our sort of celebrated educational class, and it is about the just transition. And so that 26 policymakers are in the class, and 35 master students from all sorts of disciplines. And we said, well, guys, it's like Justus and I were doing a research project with students after the murder of Theo van Gogh. We said, well, you know, everything is out. We're now going to look what's happening with that murder. So that's what we do. And we said, we're going to address the just transition. And we're going to see if we can be a social movement. Can we, as a class, start a social movement? So with these policymakers, so we're now dividing roles. Who should do what? Because a policymaker probably doesn't want to be seen to be part of a social movement, but yet again knows things that the social movement needs to know. So we don't separate. I think we use the class also to create sort of people who are able agents of change.
Thank you so much on that very positive note.